Welcome to the Safety and Risk Success podcast with me, Christian Harris. My guest today is Tanya Jenke from Corus, and she and I are going to speak about the research she's been doing. She's doing a PhD around safety metrics and external factors. So we speak about the implications of the economy and the effect of the economy and economic cycles on safety, and also the effect of COVID. And there's some really interesting insights that Tanya has been able to draw out from the research that she's been doing. We also then speak about SIFs, serious injuries and fatalities, and have a discussion about that. And that's a precursor to a webinar that Tanya and I will be running next week. If you listen to this when the podcast comes out on the 21st of May, where we're going to be talking about serious injuries, fatalities, technological trends, and legal implications. So the link to join that webinar will be in the show notes. You can find it there. But in the meantime, as a bit of a taster for that and a precursor to it, I hope you enjoy this conversation between Tanya and I. I found it really thought-provoking, and it includes a bit of a call to action around perceptions and focuses and what we do in the safety world. So hope you enjoy it. Cheers.
Welcome to the Safety and Risk Success podcast with Christian Harris. We believe that proactive safety and risk management powers business performance. Each week we explore this theme, sharing guests, stories, insights, trends, hints and tips. You can find us on all the major podcasting platforms, and video versions are available on YouTube. But for now, let's join the conversation with Christian.
Welcome to the podcast, Tanya.
Thank you, Christian. It's great to be here.
Yeah, it's good. We've got a bit of time together over this next week or so, because as we're going to be speaking about, we're going to be doing an event next week together as well.
Yeah, really looking forward to it. We should have a great discussion.
Yeah, perfect. So I'm interested to know, just as a starting point, what was it that kind of got you inspired about this world of occupational health and safety, and led to you kind of doing all this research and a PhD and all this study, etc.?
Yeah, so I started in the field of occupational health and safety, actually doing research for a professor right out of university. I did my bachelor's degree in environmental science and ended up working for a professor in a lab. But I felt very separated from the work because I was just in the lab all day, just kind of running samples. And I really wanted to get out there and meet people and kind of make that experience, draw a connection between it. And so what I really love about the field of occupational health and safety is it's all about empowering the employees to make better decisions about the hazards that they're exposed to every day. We spend so much time in work, and I think if people are knowledgeable about what they're exposed to, they can then make a choice.
Yeah, I love that. And it resonates with me in that I trained as a management consultant. So I was kind of in the theoretical side of business, and I kind of wanted to get out into the sharp end and actually do it rather than just kind of be speaking about it. So yeah, definitely agree with you on that one. So you sent me through a few of the kind of research papers that you've been involved in, and the first one I wanted to touch on with you was all about the correlation or lack of correlation, or what correlation is there between kind of economic conditions and safety performance. And I'm really interested in this on a personal level because I have this kind of passion project that I'm working on, which I call Profit from Safety, which is all about how we can prove that safety is a driver of profitability in a business. In other words, it's not just a cost, but actually it's something that we should be investing in because it can drive profit. So maybe just you could start by just talking to us a bit about the study, kind of the rough methodology, and then we can kind of get into some of the findings.
Absolutely. So I did my research at Edith Cowan University, and I was granted access to almost 20 years of occupational injury data, which is over 500,000 data points. So I was really excited to look at that data and interrogate it. And so once I kind of sat with the data and looked at it, what I was interested in was how the occupational injury rate changed over time. And it was not just over time, but what the elements were that were impacting it. And so I really organically just kind of came to research economic cycles. So looking at the economy, Western Australia is definitely driven a lot by the mining cycle. What's also very unique about Western Australia is during the global financial crisis, which was a worldwide recession, Western Australia fared very well. So I was really interested in how that impacted occupational injury rates. So that's really how I kind of came to this research topic. It was very organically, and it was really just a deep interest in looking at the change in this very large data set. And so what we did was I pulled information from the Australian Bureau of Statistics, and I compared it to occupational injury rates across 4 industries: agriculture, mining, construction, and manufacturing. And I chose mining because it's a very high level of the workforce is employed in the mining industry. It's a high hazard industry. Same with construction. I looked at manufacturing because it was more of a mid hazardous industry within Australia. Yeah. And then I chose agriculture because it was interesting to me that while it had a very few proportion of people employed in that industry, it had a very high injury rate in agriculture. So I wanted to kind of take a look at that spectrum of industries and see how the economy was impacting occupational injury rates. And so with this very large data set, I was able to find some interesting findings around how the economy impacted Western Australia.
Yeah, and something that was really interesting to me was that there were these kind of counter correlations almost. So some industries fared better on safety metrics when the economy was improving, and others worse. And talk to us a bit about that and sort of kind of headline findings of the study.
Yeah, so what was interesting to me was how manufacturing did. So as I mentioned, manufacturing was mid-hazard market, mid-proportion of people employed in that workforce. And what we found over looking at that large data set was that the manufacturing industry seemed to be more sensitive to changes in the economy. And it suggested that maybe this might be due to the size of the organization. So they tended to be between the small and medium-sized organizations. And so those organizations could be more impacted by changes in economic growth or recession. So what we found is actually as the economy grew, the rates of occupational injury rates increased in manufacturing, and then they decreased during recession periods. And the increase could be attributed to maybe those mid-sized organizations not having as rigorous training programs in place to educate employees on the hazards. They could be during economic growth periods, hiring people very quickly in order to keep up with the pace of work. And then certainly the element of contractors and how that impacts occupational injury rates. They as well could not be maybe not as well trained or well aware of the hazards in those industries. Conversely, in an industry like mining, and within the region that we were studying, most of the mining organizations are global organizations. So they have very rigorous training and safety standards in place. And also they have the financial resources in order to withstand changes in the economy. So what we found was there tended to be more of a resiliency within the mining. And also we found this as well in the construction industry. It was just more a stronger association in mining.
Yeah, there's lots of really interesting things come out of that because you can sort of see how, manufacturing, obviously manufacturing, could be quite broad. So, are you manufacturing semiconductors or whatever? And so
Mm.
there could be a kind of cyclical relationship there where in times of economic downturn, demand for certain products would fall and others could rise. And so, as you say, lots and lots of variables there. So that's kind of interesting to think about, but also the kind of overall principle that you would think as a business owner that, if the economy was improving and we were growing, we'd be making more money. But actually, if our incident rates are going up and our costs are going to be going up, we might be having higher turnover, but actually making lower profit because of these safety issues.
Absolutely. And then the other thing that I do want to mention, because we can't really talk about occupational injury rates and how they're changing through the economy without talking about underreporting. And this
Mm,
is, I think, really, it's pervasive globally. We see this underreporting called out in studies right across the world. But particularly, there has been some really good studies out of Europe, which have looked at the impact of underreporting specifically during periods of recession. And
mm,
so, while we did find that the rates of injuries decreased during a recession, it is possible that the impact of employees not feeling safe to report injuries during periods of recession is at play there. Some of the studies have
yeah.
found that employees were 20% more likely to be let go during a recession period if they had previously reported an injury. And so this is really a staggering statistic to hear because as safety professionals, we want to make sure that there is a safe environment for employees to report their injuries and they should feel that way regardless
Mm,
of what's happening to the economy. So the
mm,
idea of safety being profitable, we need to understand the full scope. And so making sure that under reporting, we're allowing employees to report as much as they can.
yeah, yeah, no, absolutely. So, I mean, the way you kind of described this was you had this data and you started looking at it and you kind of came to uh, the view that there was something going on with the economics and let's look at it and these kind of external factors. Were the findings what you expected, or were they a bit different than what you expected at the outset? And was there anything that you found that was kind of very counterintuitive that, perhaps not the overall headlines, but within the study, was there anything that you kind of came across and actually the data showed you a picture that was kind of the polar opposite of what you were expecting at the start?
Yeah, so the part that was probably the most interesting to me was we came to it as part of the methodology. And so we looked at various different economic factors, be it macroeconomic factors, so kind of those bigger ones like unemployment rate or gross domestic product value.
Yeah.
But what we found tended to have more of a nuanced impact was when we looked at industry specific factors. And so, what this told me about the research is that each industry has their own kind of vacuum of what's happening, and that injury rate can be very specific to that industry.
Mm,
Because we looked at microeconomic factors, so we looked at how much value was that particular industry generating, or how many employees were going into that particular industry, and then generated an injury specific occupational injury rate. That to me was quite interesting. I was interested in the impact between macro versus micro. And
mhm.
then certainly the impact of the size of the organization. Really, we saw that most with manufacturing. I was actually anticipating more of a sensitivity with the larger organizations. So seeing that resiliency built up around industry, occupational industry rate was really interesting to me.
Mm. I wonder if there might be something around, and I guess you need a much bigger, broader data set to look into it. But the kinds of industries, thinking about the size of organization, the kind of industries that you were looking at, I guess the bigger industries like the mining, um, were industries where they're probably fairly consistent in terms of their output, if you know what I mean. They're pretty steady in what they're doing. Whereas you could find larger organizations in certain types of industry where maybe they're a bit more kind of cyclical and up and down and a bit lumpy in terms of their revenue. So yeah, that would be interesting, wouldn't it, to think about that?
Absolutely. And it kind of came out a bit in another research paper that we did looking at the impact of COVID
Mm.
um, on injury rates. So, COVID as another external factor, I hadn't really anticipated even looking at COVID when I started my PhD in 2019, because it was obviously it's not a thing.
Yeah.
And I really, given what was happening in the world, it really kind of compelled me to bring it into the PhD research. It's a once in a lifetime event that's occurring. And I just feel like as a researcher, there's so much that we could and still can learn from the impact of COVID, particularly in the safety space.
Yeah.
So we did another study looking at it. And again, Western Australia was very unique because during COVID time, the borders were shut down, but
Mm.
the economy, unlike many other states in Australia and certainly around the world, continued to be profitable because we had the mining industry there. There were workers that were able to travel freely within the province and really generate a good, strong economy during that time period. And so it
Mm.
was interesting to see how occupational injury rates were impacted in the mining industry during that time period as well.
Mm. I know from the work that I do with, or we do with insurers, that certainly the volumes of, slips and trips and manual handling and those kinds of things plummeted in COVID as more and more people were working from home. But again, the sort of sectors that you're dealing with here are ones that kind of, I guess, continued to operate at a perhaps a slightly reduced, but a similar kind of level. So that was very interesting. So give us the findings for that then, because there were a couple of key kind of insights from what you sent over to me that I thought were really interesting.
Yeah, so we actually saw an increase for the first time in years of 8% in occupational injury rates. And so that was definitely a surprise to me. And so, speaking to some of the workers about why that might have been the case, and just really doing some interviews about that, um, there was such a focus on COVID and making sure that people were properly distancing themselves, that there were reports of people not taking the elevators to move pieces of equipment because they didn't want to be in close proximity to other people. So they would take the stairs. And so I think that there was, in reflection, I think there was an unbalanced view of hazards where COVID took a higher priority
Mhm.
compared to some of the other general hazards that workers are exposed to on an everyday basis.
Yeah, yeah. And anecdotally, I would agree with that. I mean, many of the conversations that I was having, including on this podcast at the time, were about the risk of, an over focus on COVID compared to these other risks, and both from the perspective of loss of focus, but also thinking about people returning to work and would they be retrained properly, and would there be lapses of understanding on processes through that. So there were lots and lots of, again, moving parts, but I do think that that was coming out kind of anecdotally at the time. So it was very interesting to see that the data from Western Australia did support that as well.
Absolutely. And the HSE as well has come out with some recent data as well around that, supporting that. So seeing it as well in the UK too. It's,
Yeah.
COVID is very interesting because generally, if you just even think about like the safety community and safety professionals, there was such an over reliance on PPE, which is like right at the bottom of the
Yeah.
hierarchy of controls. Like, I think people were so reactive that people were not thinking about how do we continue to move up and provide better protection for our employees, not just to COVID, but to everything else that's out there.
Yeah. And what was really fascinating was you saw the rise of incidents, but
Mhm.
there was a flip side to that, which was I don't want to spoil the punchline. Tell us what the flip side was, the around the perception.
People thought that they were actually safer, which was surprising. So we're seeing injury rates going up, but people are actually feeling safer. And so there's this like commingling of how people perceive risk and what risk, and it asks some questions. Maybe there's a threshold of how much people can perceive risk, because if they're so focused on COVID, maybe they're not perceiving the actual slips or trips, manual handling hazards that exist in their everyday job. And for people that were continuing to work and were considered essential workers, it was a very stressful time for everyone. There was a lot of unknowns going on. So there's just the general risk of being a human, engaging with people during a pandemic. And then you layer on the additional economic risks that are happening. People were very concerned about, are they going to continue to be gainfully employed and provide for their families? And then additionally, the risk perception of COVID.
Hmm. Yeah, that risk awareness piece is something that is it's a topic that I think people overlook sometimes. Because we all do risk assessments, we all do dynamic risk assessments multiple times a day. Every time we cross the road, we're doing a dynamic risk assessment. Every time we drive, we're doing uh, you know constant dynamic risk assessments, aren't we? Um, so I wonder whether there's something around maybe an overemphasis on COVID led to kind of uh, complacency rather than the fact that we just don't know how we're doing it and we're not very aware of the risks. I mean, I see that in my field where working in the kind of high hazard industries, people are so focused on safety when they're doing their high hazard jobs, and then they step away from their workplace into the canteen or the changing rooms, and then that's when something happens because their mind sort of
Yeah.
switches off to the risk. So yeah, there's lots to think about there, but it was really, really interesting.
Yeah. And one of the things I think that could be one of the lessons to move forward is just applying that risk assessment to, like you said, Christian, everyday life, like what people are doing. So some of the like continuing the hygiene around it, or continuing to evaluate what is your risk going into any situation, which I think was kind of ingrained in people and forced on people to think about for COVID. But that lesson can be applied to really everything and every hazard that people engage with.
Mm, mm. So if we think about those two studies, then the kind of one about economic cycles and about COVID, what would you say? Because they're kind of there's a commonality there around kind of external factors. So how would you kind of sum up your findings and your current view about the effect of external factors on safety performance? And then I suppose a second question on that would be, are these is this a correlation or a causation?
Mm. Well, I have lots of thoughts on external factors and how they impact safety performance. That's really the thesis of my PhD. So I think that particularly in the safety industry, we are very internally focused. We're internally focused on, what do the audits say? What are the risk assessments? What are our injury related KPIs telling us? And I think that we really need to look at the impact of external factors. If we look at the ISO guidelines for 45,001 and 3100 around risk assessment, part of the framework is advising people to look at changes in the external environment. And I just feel like it's not been put into practice enough. Based on the research that I've done so far, it's showing that there is an impact of external factors. So as we're continuing to see a plateauing in CIVs, a plateauing in fatalities in much of the world, it begs the question, if looking at something on the external, can we start to decrease that down even further?
Mm.
um, to protect more people.
Mm. Yeah. Um, and I mean, in terms of this kind of research, is this something that you're planning to take further, or you're hoping other people will take further? Should we be adding in more territories? Should we adding in more sectors? How would you kind of see the potential for that to progress?
How would I see the research continuing to
Mm.
progress?
Yeah.
If I had all the time, I'd love to continue to get into big data sets and look at more different countries, different industries, because I think we can continue to learn so much from that. And
Mm.
this particular time, we've had two big recessions, which provide interesting data points to look at, both with the global financial crisis and then the COVID recession as well. Externally, I think probably in Europe, more companies are feeling this more, but certainly with the political instability going on, with the wars going on, with the supply chain interruptions, those are all external factors as well to be mindful of. And they tend to be considered more when we're looking at the economy. But I think that we still need to consider that when organizations are looking at safety. And I think one of the best ways to raise the profile of safety is including occupational health and safety people on board so that they are responsible for providing that information and sharing it at that executive level. So it's not a side piece or an aside that's considered, but it's right at the board level.
Yeah. Yeah. I fully agree with that. And I think again, and anecdotally, in my work, the organizations that seem to be doing better from the data that I see are the ones where you do have a director or head of safety or a director or head of risk management who is on the board and who is getting involved in this stuff, and making and driving the key decisions, rather than it being kind of a bit of a silo, and a bit of a a cost center, a pain in the bum kind of thing, which sometimes safety can sadly become.
Absolutely. And I think also empowering the safety professionals to make decisions instead of
Mm.
kind of being handcuffed based on what might be happening in other siloed departments. Because it's one thing to have data and report on it, but if you can't make any changes around it because you're not empowered, you don't have the seniority, you don't have the latitude to do so, it really speaks to organizations' commitment to safety and where
Mm.
that's it.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. So we mentioned the webinar that we're co-hosting, or whatever the right word is, next week, and that's all about serious injuries and fatalities. The work that you did on the economic cycles and correlations to safety performance was focusing on kind of heavier, higher hazard industries, and obviously in these sectors, the risk of a serious injury or fatality is higher. Um, there's some really quite staggering data, isn't there, from the ILO? Uh, there's somebody, Vince Butler, who keeps threatening to come on the podcast, but we've never made it work. But he often talks about this as a scandal where, we speak often about the great work we're doing in safety, uh, let's say in the UK and the Western world, but actually, if you look at and you think that there are 6,500 people a day dying as a result of work, then that's scandalous and that's no good. So, um, focusing on serious injuries and fatalities is clearly very very important, and that's kind of what we're going to be running through in the event next week. Um, you spoke a little bit about a plateau. Could you talk a bit more about that? Because one of the things that is a question mark here is, I suppose, is where are we plateauing? Why? What more could we do about it?
Yeah, exactly. So, to go back to the ILO, I think they report 2.78 people die annually due to work. And that number really hasn't changed significantly in the last century,
Mm.
which is absolutely, I agree with him, is scandalous. There are so many brilliant minds that are capturing data, that are analyzing it, that are implementing safety well, and how we're unable to drive down that number because we're hitting a plateau really is a call to action for people to see what we can do to drive that number down. Why are we not seeing a change? Why are we seeing a change more in injuries that are happening in the workplace, but yet we're not with fatalities? And so if we look at some of the examples of fatalities and, large fatalities, and a lot of times we want to, organizations might talk about how are they surprised by this fatality that occurred. One example is, the Texas City oil refinery, which in Houston, which killed 15 people and I think injured 180 people. And they had reported to the US Chemical Board annually very low injury rates within their organization. So I think that this talks about the over reliance on injury based KPIs that a lot of organizations use to predict whether fatalities are happening. And what we're finding is it's inaccurate and it's not a good predictor of future fatalities. And so I think that there's really a shift that needs to occur in how are we going to predict whether fatalities are happening and what measures are we using. And I think that the plateauing of fatalities has really indicated that to us.
Yeah. Are we, and I'm not saying this is my opinion, but I'm just saying this to sort of be a bit provocative and devil's advocate. Are we at the point where actually we can't really improve? Maybe to do the work we need to do to build the buildings, to create the widgets, we just have to accept that some people are going to die, and that's it.
I think that, and I know that's not your opinion, Christian. I know that.
Hopefully nobody
Yeah.
cuts that up into a clip and starts putting it out on social media.
No, I know that's not your opinion. And I think talking to the families of workers who don't come home from work the next day, any number of fatalities that are occurring is too many. And I absolutely believe that with the dedication, the investment, and the brain power of safety professionals, there is absolutely room to bring that down. I think that we need to start questioning the data and some of these well embedded practices and really questioning, are they being effective for us? Are injury based KPIs, are they useful? And are they telling us what they need to tell us? Or is it just a metric that gets passed and reported on an annual report that really doesn't impact and really doesn't inform any key decisions?
Mm. I guess there's also like a mindset here around. I had a really fascinating conversation with Simon Casson a couple of months ago on the podcast about zero harm, and is zero harm ethically justifiable? And one of the points that Simon made was, we need to maybe more clearly define harm, because if we say zero harm in its purest form, then we would be saying that it's unacceptable in any way, shape, or form for somebody to have a paper cut, let's say. And whilst, of course, there are people out there who, have illnesses or diseases or whatever the right word is, and a paper cut could be very serious for them. For the vast, vast, vast majority of people, a paper cut is nothing more than a paper cut. Whereas somebody dying at work is clearly, on a whole other spectrum. So maybe some of the mindsets, the language, the terminologies around zero harm need to be more clearly defined, and what kind of mission we're on around safety. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, definitely. And I think it also comes back to earlier what we talked about around underreporting. Zero harm is to have those, that approach, I think is very counterintuitive. And to Simon's point about zero harm, people are going to be harmed at work, whether it's a paper cut. And I'm sure you've been into organizations as well that are so focused on ergonomics, maybe, that they're not paying attention to the higher hazard industries. So there's absolutely a spectrum. And I think it's a responsibility of the organization to really have some kind of logical common sense around where are they going to focus, where are they going to prioritize their safety prevention and their fatality preventions. Like, let's not get caught up in worrying about paper cuts for people. Let's worry about the hazards that are actually going to kill someone or kill multiple people or seriously injure people. And I feel like somewhere along the line, we kind of lost sight of that. We kind of looked at the whole gamut of all injuries, and we're diluting out what we're actually trying to do.
Mm. Yeah, and I think from a a senior leadership team, a board perspective, also looking at the cost aspect is important as well, because numbers are the language of business. And again, what's the cost of some people having paper cuts? Very, very little. What's the cost of a death? Obviously massive.
Absolutely.
But also what's the cumulative cost of the manual handlings and the slips, trips, and falls of the world? Well, those are actually larger than the costs of the fatalities, because obviously there are much fewer fatalities. So we do need to have a balanced approach, in my opinion. But yeah, focusing in on where we can keep people safe and stop these kind of serious injuries that are either recoverable, like broken bones and things like that, or sort of life altering or life ending injuries. So that's where we've got to really focus.
Yeah, and so going back to your question about like how do we help drive that number down? I think that there needs to be a shift in rebalancing where people are prioritizing their efforts. I think that maybe it's just been too diluted out.
Yeah, that's something I can definitely get on board with. So Tanya, we've got this webinar on next week. I should know the date off the top of my head, but it's the 21st, isn't it? Do you want to run through what we're going to be covering, or do you want me to do that, and then we can just chat a little bit about it?
Sure. So we're going to be talking about SIFs in high hazard industries. I'll talk a little bit about research and also how technology can assist organizations in that area. And I think we're also going to be joined by two esteemed guests. Do you want to talk about them?
Yes, so we've got somebody from a business perspective who's in a kind of high hazard industry. We haven't announced the names yet, so I'm going to keep those under wraps. And then we've got somebody who's going to kind of come on and give us some legal insights and implications and perspectives on this as well, because obviously, as with all things in the world of safety, there are the two sides to this, aren't there? There's the we want to protect people and keep them safe side, and there's the we've got to protect the organization from a legal and a financial perspective too. So I thought it'd be good to have the balance of both of those things covered. So we'll include the link for the webinar in the show notes for the podcast. But if anybody else wanted to get in touch with you or follow you or whatever, is LinkedIn the best place to do that, other than coming
Absolutely.
and joining the podcast, the webinar? Sorry.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm on LinkedIn. I love to hear from anyone really interested in other people's thoughts as well, because I think when you research, you get as much as you try and get a balanced view across the board, you can kind of go down a rabbit hole. So I'd love to hear other people's thoughts and ideas in that area.
Perfect. Just before we wrap up, Tanya, was there anything else that we didn't cover that you were keen to cover? Anything I didn't ask you about, any of your research or anything? I tried to get into it as much as I thought we could.
No, that was great, Christian. Thank you so much. And thanks so much for the opportunity to chat with you. I really am looking forward to the webinar on the 21st, and this is great.
Good stuff. Well, appreciate your time, and well done for all of this great work. Very informative, thought-provoking, and hopefully, the outcome of it will be that rebalancing, that reshifting that we talked about. So yeah, well done on behalf of the audience. So thank you for joining me, and thanks to you who've joined Tanya and I today, and we look forward to seeing you again on another episode of the podcast soon.
Thanks for joining us on the Safety and Risk Success podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please hit follow and do share on social media. Does anyone you know spring to mind as a great guest, even yourself? If so, please contact us on podcast@slipsafety.co.uk. See you next week for another episode.